The question of the historicity, or historical truth, of the resurrection of Jesus is one of the most important and controversial questions that many thinkers and scholars have weighed in on. For the approximately 2.6 billion Christians in the world, Jesus' resurrection represents the core of their religious faith, and as such, many critics of religion see this miraculous claim as a very large target. In defense of this claim, and sometimes for their own religious purposes, many religious thinkers put forth evidence and arguments for the veracity of the miraculous claim. Despite the importance of the question and the sheer number of participants in the overall debate, few, to my knowledge, have treated the topic with a certain level of philosophical depth. This claim may seem controversial, almost ridiculous, but we will see through a public debate between two specialists, even the most knowledgeable thinkers don't go very far. Of course, a debate may not necessarily be the best place to find the deepest and most sophisticated arguments, and I grant this to the viewer. If there is enough demand, I would be happy to dissect another source, but I chose the debate medium and the debate in question because of who the participants are, the nature of the arguments, and the fact that this medium is the most likely to influence general talking points due to ease of access and consumption. Taken seriously, the question of the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus takes us to some interesting and unexpected places. As mentioned, to take a step in examining this topic, we will look at a 2006 debate between William Lane Craig and Bart Ehrman. For those unfamiliar, Bart Ehrman is a preeminent New Testament scholar who frequently attacks Christian beliefs on historical grounds. William Lane Craig is a leading Christian philosopher and apologist who frequently debates critics of religion. My intention in this video is to analyze a few of the arguments in the debate, and ultimately show how the debate doesn't ever get to the core of the issue. In doing so, we will explore the nature of historical and scientific claims of extraordinary stature, and try to shed more light on the question that the debate participants attempted to resolve. For the curious viewer, I would recommend watching the debate, but for those who would rather not, I will provide enough information to make watching the debate unnecessary. Before I start, I want to say a couple things up front. First, I am not approaching the topic as a biblical scholar or historian of early Christianity. I am neither of those, and can provide no insight on those topics from those fields, and so I will not really be discussing them. I don't want to get bogged down in the nitty-gritty of historical detail and textual criticism. My focus is purely philosophical. Second, a couple of the points I will make are alluded to by Bart himself, but I will go further than him, and his position as stated within the debate is somewhat muddled and contradictory. I will try to be clear about when my position is echoed by one of the participants. Third, for any Christian members of the audience, this video might, at first, seem pretty harsh. This is somewhat unavoidable, but I hope that by the end, my true argument will be a little bit more clear. To state it up front, this is not an anti-religion video. I am attempting to clarify, methodologically and philosophically, where science ends and religion begins. I myself am not a Christian or really religious at all, but I think the topics herein will be of interest to everyone, Christian or not. And lastly, if you enjoy philosophical content, I would highly recommend subscribing to my channel and giving this video a like. I always strive to provide thought-provoking, high-quality scripts to my audience. Alright, let's dive in. To be able to analyze the arguments from the debate and ultimately go beyond them, we first have to be acquainted with them. As I said earlier, Ehrman and Craig are debating the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. To make that a bit more clear, they are debating whether or not the miraculous resurrection of Jesus by God can be established historically as a fact. William Lane Craig thinks it can be, and Bart Ehrman thinks it cannot. We can look at Craig's position first, because he has the opening speech and mentions many of the further argumentative themes in said speech. Craig thinks the historicity of Jesus' miraculous resurrection can be established, and not only that, he also thinks that this explanation is to be preferred over naturalistic or non-supernatural explanations. The reason for this is that, as Craig argues, there are some minimal facts, including things like Jesus' empty tomb and the visions people had of Jesus post-mortem, that scholars and the theories they propose must account for and explain. And Craig argues that the divine resurrection is the best explanation because it has the most explanatory power and scope and highest level of plausibility. Ehrman's first position in his opening statement is that the sources establishing these historical facts are very unreliable. It boils down to a couple main problems. 1. The writers of the Gospels and other sources had vested interests in what they were writing. They weren't recording facts disinterestedly. They had a narrative they wanted to be true, so it might not be warranted to treat them as objective sources. 2. They weren't writing contemporaneously, having inherited what Ehrman claims is a dubious oral tradition, or in his view, more like a long game of telephone. 3. They are highly inconsistent. Better sources would be independent and broadly consistent in their details, but Ehrman sees them as contradicting each other. These points are cool to think about, but his second position is more interesting philosophically. He claims that a historian can only establish what probably happened, since history is essentially a non-repeatable experiment, which the scientist can only infer causes and results from indirectly. He then asks, what is a miracle? Well, it's by definition the least probable thing that could happen. Thus, a historian could never claim that a miracle probably happened, because it's always the least probable thing. Wow, how elegant. Unfortunately for Bart, as Craig points out, this argument has two major problems. For one, Craig argues that this is basically just a watered-down version of David Hume's argument against miracles, which, to restate it simply and uncharitably, is that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and because the laws of nature can't be violated, miracles can't happen. Aside from the obvious pseudo-circularity of this, and Ehrman's argument, where he defines miracles as the least probable thing, to then claim that historians can't say it happened because it's the least probable thing, Craig points out that there is also a misunderstanding of the probability calculus going on here. Again, Ehrman claims that a miracle is the least probable thing that could occur, but this is only the intrinsic, or what probability theorists call the prior probability of a miracle. The problem is, historians shouldn't be concerned with intrinsic and prior probabilities. They should be concerned with probabilities given some body of evidence, specifically those facts mentioned by Craig in his opening statement. Basically, even though something may be intuitively or generally improbable, we have to update our assessment of the probability in the face of new evidence. The formula Craig uses, which is a kind of complicated form of Bayes' theorem, will be shown on the screen now. R here stands for the supernatural resurrection of Jesus by God. E is the specific historical evidence, like the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances. B is our general background knowledge of the world, like the laws of physics. Craig claims that Ehrman was only thinking of the probability of R given B, the intrinsic prior probability, which is the probability of the resurrection only considered with our general knowledge of the world. And he grants that is very, very low. But Craig's crucial point is that we have to condition on the evidence at hand rather than just condition on how likely in general a miracle is. Hence, probability of R given B and E. Now that we understand why we must use this formula, let's look at the numerator. Probability of E given R and B is the probability that the evidence, like the empty tomb, would appear, given that the resurrection occurred and what we know about the world. This seems reasonably high. If the resurrection did occur, it makes sense that the evidence we see probably would have been generated. Probability of R given B is the intrinsic probability that Ehrman was thinking of. And this, as both thinkers admit, is very low. In the denominator, which is an expanded version of probability of E given B using the law of total probability, we have the numerator again, plus a different version of the numerator with the negation of R utilized instead. The negation of R signifies any naturalistic explanation, as Craig states, for the evidence that we see, like perhaps Jesus' body was stolen by grave robbers, or something like that. Thus, the probability of the resurrection having happened based on the evidence isn't just the sheer unlikeliness of a miracle occurring, it depends on the likelihood of the naturalistic alternatives to the resurrection hypothesis. To see this, as Craig shows, we can rewrite the equation as x over x plus y, because the numerator is repeated in the denominator. X is the probability concerning the resurrection, and y is a catch-all term for the alternative. As y goes to 0, the probability that the resurrection occurred goes to 1, and since there aren't really any widely accepted naturalistic alternatives to the resurrection hypothesis, as Craig states, we are driven to accept that the resurrection happened. Ehrman's first rebuttal to this is a good one, but it could use a bit of sophistication. His defense amounts to the fact that nearly any naturalistic alternative automatically outweighs the resurrection hypothesis in probability. This is basically the extent of how he states it, and he supports it by sketching a few naturalistic stories that don't involve God, but we can state this a little bit better and make it more clear. Remember how in the numerator, probability of R given B, the intrinsic probability, was quite low? Well, how about the probability of the negation of R given B, or not R given B? Almost any naturalistic explanation, as Ehrman claims, automatically will have a much higher probability because our background knowledge B is almost completely naturalistic and scientific. When coupling a naturalistic explanation with a naturalistic background knowledge, there is an intrinsic accord there which, almost mechanically, grants it a higher probability. Thus, according to Bart, though not exactly in this language, the miraculous resurrection cannot be established by a historian even after considering this full probability, because any naturalistic explanation will accord with our background knowledge. Even a very weak naturalistic theory will necessarily beat a well-formulated miraculous one, because a miraculous one rests on hidden theological prior beliefs and biases that a historian must set aside. Basically, B, our background knowledge, as a historian can't include God, thus making probability of not R given B automatically quite high. This is sensible, but might seem a little bit vague. We can take this even further than Bart and make it more decisive. To do this, we are going to let n equal the set containing n1, n2, all the way to nk, and this will be the set of all naturalistic explanations. We can assume it is finite for our simple purpose here, and that each ni is disjoint from the others. We further assume that the set containing R, n1, n2 to nk is the exhaustive set of explanations, meaning we can use the law of total probability. So unlike what Craig claims and what Bart seems to go along with, rather than just spinning one or two absurd tales, we can consider all scholarly conjectures, half-baked theories, and even highly implausible accounts. The term y in x over x plus y must include all of these if we are serious about doing a calculation. Against the resurrection hypothesis, we must consider all naturalistic alternatives. So the formula then becomes this. The only difference between this and the previous formula is that rather than a single alternative to R, which is what Craig frames it as, we have replaced this with a sum of many different alternatives. Looking at it as x over x plus y, while still true, makes it seem like y must be a single, extremely well-formulated hypothesis that Craig explicitly thinks won't make much sense. We will dig into why he thinks this more later, but when we see the true nature of y, which is actually a sum of all naturalistic alternatives, it seems much less likely that the probability of R given B and E will be high at all. To be clear and fair, our probability mustn't go to 0 now. In fact, it won't because our naturalistic alternatives was a finite set. It will converge to some positive number, it just all depends on how we assess probabilities. So, this is the debate as it happened up to the point I want to discuss, namely the plausibility of assessing explanations for extraordinary scenarios, historically and scientifically. Ehrman makes an error with his probabilistic claim that Craig rightly points out as being incorrect, but Ehrman's rebuttal, with some much-needed augmentation, effectively refutes it. But there are deeper problems with this debate that barely even get touched upon, and those are what I want to dive into now. The first point I'd like to make here is more of an internal methodological critique that will be unlikely to resonate with either side of this debate, but I think it deserves to be said regardless. The modern academic, scientific environment is an extremely rigorous place where even small claims require heaps of evidence, reproducibility, and a healthy dose of good presentation for even a moderate level of community acceptance. And even then, scientists and thinkers after these results will still target the findings, hoping to disprove them. Even small claims often require extraordinary and robust evidence. Now, as Bart pointed out, history only happens once. We can't run back the clock and try again to see if the same thing results from like circumstances. Already then, reproducibility is completely out the window. I can't and won't speak much to the quality of evidence concerning the resurrection of Jesus, but I tend to think it isn't necessarily the strongest grouping. Regardless, the resurrection of Jesus is an extraordinary claim, and thus requires extraordinary evidence, at least as far as academic historical acceptance, which is the only place where historicity is really established. And that just simply is not on display here. Outside of a personal religious decision, there just isn't enough evidence for an unbiased historian to treat it as established. But to make my point a little bit more concrete, the exact same thing applies to naturalistic alternatives to the resurrection. Sure, scholars can concoct various stories that account for the evidence, and some will seem more intuitively plausible than others, but that is all they are, stories. A historian will be much more likely to prefer a naturalistic alternative, if only because it relies on background knowledge that does not include the Christian God, but between naturalistic alternatives, it's far from clear how to establish one or the other given the unfortunate state of the evidence. Basically, far from whether or not the resurrection hypothesis can be established historically, I would honestly contend that in this specific scenario with this week of evidence, it's more warranted to remain in a kind of agnosticism. If you take the resurrection hypothesis seriously as a theory, then it would be methodologically sketchy to accept it, and it would also be methodologically sketchy to accept other hypotheses unless some new, better evidence was unearthed that sheds a little bit more light on the situation. We'll come back to this topic more later, but for now, let's move on. Let's look back at this formula. William Lane Craig says that Y must include the naturalistic alternative to the resurrection hypothesis, which states that God supernaturally raised Jesus from the dead, and then Jesus appeared before his followers post-mortem. But when I heard this, my immediate question was, why? Should Y really only consist of naturalistic alternatives? Craig favors the theory that Jesus was supernaturally raised from the dead. But behind that statement, there is always the addendum, by God. Jesus was raised from the dead by God. In other words, Craig opens the door to the miraculous, and that door, for some reason, invariably leads to the Christian God. But is that warranted? Craig's purpose in the debate was, in part, evangelical. He wanted to convince those yet unconvinced that Christianity was true over atheism. But as is seemingly always the case with Christians debating atheists, this opposition between Christian belief and atheism is clearly a false dichotomy. To a person who doesn't already favor Christianity as an explanation, there is no inherent reason to assume that God was the one who raised Jesus from the dead. If we open the door to the supernatural and the miraculous, a truly rational person must consider all of the alternatives. And even if we stick with roughly Christian stories, there are still problems. To see this, let's turn to the Gospel of Judas. The Gospel of Judas is a non-canonical account of the life of Jesus written by Gnostic Christians. It was rejected as a heresy by mainstream Christians and thus wasn't included in the Bible. For a deeper dive, Religion for Breakfast has a fantastic video on this topic, and the Gospel of Judas is free to read online. It's notable for its unique inversion of typical Christian cosmology, and its portrayal of Judas, as we will soon see. In the Gospel of Judas, the God of the Old Testament is not the true God of the universe. Rather, the true God willed lower deities or emanations into existence, and one of these lower divinities, called Saklos, created earth and mankind. Jesus is actually a messenger from the higher divinities and the true God, not from Saklos. But his disciples don't see that. The Gospel of Judas portrays the disciples as mistakenly thinking Jesus comes from Saklos, or the God of the Old Testament, and the only one who recognizes Jesus' true higher nature is Judas, though whether or not the portrayal of Judas is positive is hotly debated by academics. With this background out of the way, let me posit another miraculous, broadly Christian account of the resurrection informed by this Gnostic gospel, with some liberties. To be clear, this is a hypothetical and is merely inspired by the Gospel of Judas. It does not come from it directly. Jesus dies on the cross, and Saklos, aware that Jesus is not his emissary, decides to reassert his power and exploit the circumstances. Saklos makes Jesus' body disappear, then manifests himself in Jesus' image to Jesus' former followers. He reinforces the disciples' mistake of believing in himself as the power behind Jesus, not the higher God, thus accounting for the fact that Christians to this day identify the God of the Old Testament and the God of Jesus as one and the same. This is my story. Now I have to ask you, given the historical evidence and the general background knowledge available to a historian, which theory is true? The generally accepted by Christians resurrection hypothesis, or my Gospel of Judas hypothetical? Without getting into the particulars of the historicity of the Gospel of Judas and whatnot, which as I'll show later don't actually matter, the unfortunate truth is that the historian has absolutely no reason to prefer either of these. Why should they? God or Soklos? How can a historian hope to discern which of these inaccessible metaphysical entities caused the apparent miracle? Both stories suitably account for the evidence at hand, and there is nothing empirical left to say which is more preferable. Even if one shows that the historical account in the Gospel of Judas is factually wrong somehow, and points to Jesus' own identification of himself as the son of the God from the Old Testament, this means absolutely nothing. For it is just as conceivable to an unbiased historian that Jesus was simply wrong. Jesus can only be unerringly correct in an everyday Christian POV. Basically, the jump from miraculous post-mortem reappearance to specifically Christian resurrection is one that only makes sense to a person that is already sympathetic to a Christian worldview. To put it simply and definitively, even if the historian, confronted with irrefutable evidence that Jesus rose from the dead miraculously, which I don't think in principle at least is impossible considering the probability argument from before, then the historian cannot rationally decide which inaccessible supernatural power is behind it. Purely to hammer my point home, one could even claim that Cthulhu did it, or that Jesus is a necromorph resurrected by the Brethren Moons, or that literally any supernatural force caused it, and it will not matter. As long as the supernatural story one tells is consistent with the factual evidence, one can no longer decide between them. To put it philosophically, the theories are underdetermined by the available facts. Underdetermination means that, at present, the empirical evidence isn't enough to rationally decide which theory is true. Multiple incompatible theories can be made to fit the data, and evidence alone won't say which is correct. In fact, there will never be enough natural, historical evidence to warrant rational acceptance of one supernatural explanation over any other, as I will argue now. At the risk of creating a slightly reductive example, let's say you and I are standing in front of a locked door that we are completely sure nobody is inside of. As we stand there, some papers begin getting slipped under the door with innocuous messages. Some of the messages seem personal to me, so I claim that the force behind the door is my grandma's ghost, RIP. But you claim that your grandma used to slip sweet notes with a hand-drawn heart under your bedroom door when you were a kid, so it's actually your grandma. Suddenly, the next note comes under the door and it has a little heart on it. You feel vindicated because this obviously means it's your grandma, but I push back, saying it's still my grandma's ghost. She just overheard us and wanted to make you feel comfortable. This story can go on, but the point is that there is no evidence that we can't somehow incorporate into our respective theories of what's behind the door if we wanted to. Even if the notes literally begin claiming that one side is true, the other side could very easily fight this, maybe by saying they had angered their grandma's ghost and now it is messing with them. The theories can always be modified slightly or even majorly to account for new circumstances. Either way, because we can't get into the door, we can't ever directly confirm what theory is true. We can even encode this issue into our probability formula to see how vanishingly small it looks like the probability for the resurrection hypothesis could be. As before, we let n be the set of all naturalistic explanations, and now we let the new set S equal to S1, S2, all the way to Sj be the set of all disjoint supernatural explanations. We also let the set containing R, N1 through Nk, S1 through Sj be the exhaustive set of explanations, thus again allowing us to use the law of total probability. The formula then becomes this. As before, we have an extra sum of natural explanations in the bottom, but now we have a further extra sum of supernatural explanations. For R, the resurrection hypothesis to be favored, as Craig stated, y must be sufficiently small in x over x plus y. But that seems to be more and more unlikely given everything we've seen so far, with y now including every conceivable supernatural theory that accounts for the historical evidence. If we truly approach this in an unbiased way, open-minded even to the miraculous, we will find it hard to choose any explanation, and will certainly find it impossible to establish one miraculous force over any other. Bart briefly touched on this issue when he said that the historian has no access to God, and thus can't establish the resurrection. But Craig, always pushing back, rightly recognizes that for things like physics, positing things we have no access to, like higher dimensions and parallel universes and invisible spacetime and hidden particles, is a fully acceptable practice because these inaccessible things inform a larger framework with massive explanatory power. Sure, we can't ever see some higher dimension of spacetime, but the overall theory supports the evidence and makes predictions about new data. Thus, if the Christian God hypothesis has explanatory and predictive power in this situation, it could be warranted to posit this inaccessible force. But as we've just seen, the God hypothesis doesn't provide any further explanatory power over any other supernatural explanation, because any supernatural explanation can basically be invented or distorted to account for the apparent facts, at no extra cost, and will thus be just as explanatory as any other. Warning, some of the content in this portion may be gruesome to viewers. In 1959, leading up to what would eventually be called the Dyatlov Pass incident, 10 hikers trekked through the Ural Mountains in Russia. The environment was frigid and unforgiving, and one participant left for medical reasons after only a few days. The remaining 9 continued, and after failing to make anticipated contact, search parties were sent into the mountains to locate the missing group. What those searchers found was haunting, and generated one of the most fascinating mysteries of all time. All 9 hikers were dead. The tent was abandoned and collapsed, but belongings left inside were all neatly arranged. The fabric of the tent was slashed open, but from the inside, suggesting they were attempting to flee from something dangerous, but something that also left their equipment undisturbed. The hikers' bodies were in an even more mysterious state. Many appeared to have straightforwardly perished from hypothermia, but one had apparently bitten off a portion of his own knuckle, and others had bizarre and unsettling injuries that seemed to make no sense. Fractured, almost bludgeoned skulls, crushed chests, empty eye sockets, and missing tongues. Some lost their lips and eyebrows. Even stranger, radioactive material was detected on the clothing of one of the hikers. When I learned about this event, my imagination was set on fire. I read every explanation possible, thought of some really stupid ones on my own, and just enjoyed the pool of these morbid, mysterious happenings. Many naturalistic explanations have been set forth, including avalanches, weapons testing, murder, and many others. But it is widely acknowledged that every explanation seems to leave something out and just isn't satisfying, though the avalanche hypothesis is the leading one for most scholars. The only thing that can really be established is that there was an overwhelming car crash level force involved that produced the skull and chest wounds. Now sure, this is all really cool and weird, but weren't we talking about Jesus? Well, yes, I bring this up because these incidents form a useful parallel to the resurrection. They are historical events that have disparate pieces of evidence that seem to point beyond naturalistic explanations. And please be assured, many amateur detectives have used the supernatural to explain the Dyatlov Pass incident. The most common supernatural explanation is the Yeti, a strong, potentially partially radioactive snow creature who scared the hikers out of their shelter and ended up beating and consuming the ones that it was able to catch. Yetis are already believed by the fringes to exist in places like this, so it's not a stretch to say one lived there and caused this unfortunate disaster. But just as before, one can posit any supernatural explanation to account for these. So I can posit that a UFO, piloted by reptilian aliens from the Andromeda Galaxy, was hovering near the area and used a mind control ray on the hikers, forcing them to flee from their tent without disturbing their things, and then caused those other injuries after abducting them and running tests before returning them to Earth. My story explains everything, just as much as any naturalistic explanation, and definitely just as much as a Yeti, so it should be considered. Now admit it, when I was describing this, you probably thought it was pretty stupid, like obviously not true, even in comparison to the Yeti hypothesis. And you may have thought the same thing about my Gospel of Judas story, or my briefly mentioned Cthulhu hypothesis. Cthulhu is obviously made up, and so is the mind control reptilian UFO. But for an atheist, so is God, and for people who aren't any fun, so is the Yeti. So why is it that despite how an unbiased historian can rationally look at these different stories and see that they're equally likely or equally unlikely and equally unprovable, there is a sense in which it feels like the Yeti story and definitely the Christian resurrection, should be favored over the others as explanations because the others are obviously made up, despite them all being equally invalid in this context. Some might say it's the mystical pull of the truth, calling you to the light of God, but that doesn't explain why the Yeti hypothesis sounds less absurd than the UFO, unless you're also willing to say that the Yeti is real and exhibits an epistemological tug. If one is trying to look at this without preconceptions, then saying it's the pull towards the truth is definitely a preconception because it assumes what is true and assumes that truth is actively pulling the historian. I would posit that, apart from whether or not one supernatural explanation is true over any other, what matters the most in terms of the intuitive appeal is merely what stories we are familiar with, what stories are culturally imbued with the highest level of realism, outside of any naturalistic accord. This is why an American, even an atheist American, would be more likely to say that demons could be real and that jinn are definitely fake, or that Bigfoot is more likely to be real than the Mongolian deathworm. They all basically have the same level or lack of evidence. It just depends which stories have been culturally given to the listener as more or less acceptable. Why do so many people not blink when William Lane Craig claims that Jesus was miraculously raised from the dead, and then immediately assumes God was behind it? Because despite how unfounded that jump is, it is the only culturally acceptable thesis on the matter. Any other explanation, like my Cthulhu hypothesis or Brethren Moon theory, just won't be seen as acceptable, but the Christian explanation has the weight of a congregation of believers, hundreds of books, and everything else. It has the vibe of legitimacy that immediately places it above other supernatural explanations. So already, there seems to be a bias towards the supernatural explanations we already know. But could there be a similar reason why naturalistic explanations also seem so impotent compared to the supernatural ones? Why does the avalanche theory just pale in comparison to the Yeti theory? Why does an elaborate grave robbing conspiracy followed by mass messianic hallucination seem way less likely and way less plausible than the divine resurrection? I will fully admit that on the face of it, the conspiracy and hallucination story just seems ridiculous and highly improbable, and that it feels like the resurrection is more plausible. And I'll also be the first person to admit that I almost want the supernatural explanation to be true, especially in the case of the Dyatlov Pass. I tend to not believe in the supernatural, but it's almost like I want to. It's cooler, it's more fun. In a way, it matches the awe and mystery inspired by the evidence. The avalanche just seems so reductive for the sheer bizarreness of the Dyatlov Pass incident, and the grave robbing conspiracy seems so bland when thinking about the empty tomb of Jesus. And there's a sense in which, despite the fact that something like a grave robbing conspiracy with mass hallucinations is more in line with our naturalistic conception of the world, it also seems to violate many notions of what a good explanation really is. Occam's razor suggests that the simplest explanation is the best one to hold, the one with the fewest coincidences and layers and nuances and complications. Well, what could be more coincidental and layered and nuanced and complicated than some naturalistic explanation that leaves behind an empty tomb and tens, if not hundreds of witnesses claiming that they saw a recently executed man performing miracles? Any naturalistic explanation, despite our overall scientific worldview, is just immediately lacking in the intuitive appeal. Our brains want something clean, simple, nice, and elegant, not complicated, messy, arbitrary, and contingent. And they want an explanation that satisfies the tension that the evidence set up. They want it to match the mystery. If this is true, then assessing the explanatory power or plausibility of some explanation can be an inherently biased project if left unchecked. The world isn't simple and clean and elegant. It is messy, chaotic, and random. And explanations that allow for chaos and messiness shouldn't be intuitively discounted. Our preference for beauty and simplicity and familiarity is ultimately just that, a preference. It also helps that, at least in the Christian resurrection case, the hypothesis makes the happenings mean something. The explanation fits the evidence into the story of the universe and God's redemption of mankind. It has a teleological appeal. In this way, the explanation just makes sense. It satisfies. A naturalistic explanation, despite the fact that it accords with our background knowledge and doesn't require an unjustified jump, will just not have the same power, and thus won't be intuitively valued in the same way. Future Branamander here. I'm listening as I'm editing, and I'm worried that my point is getting a little bit lost in the weeds, so I just wanted to clear that up. Basically, my argument here is that there are a lot of extra theoretical considerations that affect how we assess a story or theory's plausibility, that have no place in the probability calculus, like cultural familiarity, cultural acceptability, teleological appeal. All these things influence how intuitively plausible something seems, but yet you'll notice there's no spot for that to be put into the probability formula. A lot of the things that make us at first think a theory is good or bad are basically just aesthetic concerns, and those tend to favor the more supernatural, simple stories. Let's summarize. The resurrection is an extraordinary claim and requires extraordinary evidence, and as a historical question with associated evidence, must be assessed probabilistically. In principle, as we saw with the formula, a historian could say that Jesus was miraculously resurrected. Given that we have to consider every single naturalistic alternative, this seems unlikely but not impossible. Unfortunately, if we say something miraculous occurred, we must resist the intuitive urge to immediately jump to the Christian explanation. We must confront every single supernatural explanation, and it is here that we meet with an insurmountable roadblock. A scientist or a historian can't have supernatural commitments, and thus will be unable to parse the supernatural claims. Despite this, they will likely feel drawn to the supernatural ones they know, and could even feel drawn to that one they know over the naturalistic explanations because of cultural familiarity and realism, as well as simplicity and elegance. Considering all of this, I think it makes sense why most people either default to the Christian God divine resurrection, or a kind of naturalistic agnosticism over the alternatives. If you accept the miracle, it's natural and culturally sensible to accept what is basically the only allowable explanation around for it. If you deny the miracle, you must then choose over a set of messy, inelegant alternatives that don't satisfy for the reasons we discussed above, and you might as well just not commit to any particular one. It is probably quite clear to the viewer that I do not think Jesus was divinely resurrected. I fit squarely into the second camp, and to be clear, I did my due diligence. I take what evidence there is seriously, but I just don't think it's enough. As far as an alternative, I basically don't think it matters that much, because it's probably an unanswerable question as it is right now. In x over x plus y, I think y is closer to 1, but I have no idea which element in y is to be preferred. And this implies another quite obvious problem with the assessment of explanations. I said that I think y is closer to 1. I say that in the light of everything I've argued for so far. But if someone cornered me and asked me to show some calculations and actually assign probabilities, I'd be at a complete loss, especially regarding the supernatural explanations. How can one possibly assign a meaningful probability distribution here? For the naturalistic explanations, it may be difficult and controversial, but isn't impossible in principle. But how does one say that one supernatural force is more likely to be real and active than another, after getting rid of those intuitive reasons that I outlined above? I'm open to ideas, but at this time I would claim that it is a category error. Deciding between supernatural explanations at its core is not a rational question. It is entirely resistant to probabilistic assessment. And as someone who doesn't subscribe to any particular religion, I always find it suspect when apologists and philosophers go from relatively innocuous arguments establishing some kind of divinity, and then jump to a very particular interpretation of that divinity. Whether it be the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, Pascal's wager, the argument from design, you name it. All of these, despite their numerous flaws, powerfully argue for the acceptance of or belief in some type of higher power. But the problem is, they can all be wielded by followers of incompatible religions. A Muslim, a Jew, a Zoroastrian, a Christian, a Baha'i, and whatever else can all argue for some kind of prime mover or uncaused cause using a variant of the cosmological argument. And then they will all jump to their interpretation of whatever that prime mover is, and it is always unwarranted given the evidence and the argument used to establish it. How are you sure that the force that created the universe is the same specific deity mentioned in your scripture? The result of the cosmological argument, at least in its more acceptable and least augmented forms, is merely a kind of abstract thing that sets everything into motion causally. It says absolutely nothing theologically, yet this argument is championed by religious thinkers who infallibly use it to establish their own particular deity. How does this relate to the resurrection? Because just like these arguments, it, if we speak very charitably, establishes that something miraculous seems to have occurred, and then inexplicably jumps to an extremely specific and rationally unwarranted explanation for what is behind that miracle. For any Christians in the audience, I truly hope that this doesn't seem too aggressive, because I genuinely don't mean it like that. In fact, I think in many ways, this is perfectly compatible with a particular conception of Christianity. If God truly does test humanity through faith and faith alone, then why would God have placed any empirical certainty regarding his or her or its existence at all? If the divine resurrection of Jesus by God can be established historically, doesn't that automatically cheapen the resulting faith? In other words, if evidence compels faith, is the value of faith undermined? Earlier, I argued that there is always an unexplainable jump from an argument to a specific explanation, and I also said that deciding between supernatural explanations is not a rational decision. Despite calling it not rational, I didn't mean this in an insulting way. Many philosophers, like Kierkegaard, would say that this is where one must, and clearly does, take a leap of faith. Maybe I'm wrong here, these are preliminary thoughts. Regardless, this video and its arguments were not intended to disprove God or anything like that, and a careful listen will show that absolutely nothing here is about disproving. This was merely a philosophical pushback against natural theology, which is the attempt to discern features of the divine using empirical evidence and philosophical argument. I've tried to show with my arguments that this is not a viable project, and that really, the supernatural is not the domain of the rational. This video is also a philosophical clarification on what factors are at play when involving extraordinary scientific and empirical claims. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is obviously a controversial topic and might make some people angry, but it is one that I feel very strongly about and wanted to contribute to the discussion on. As a quick side note, it is very possible that some of these arguments have been made before. I make no claim of novelty. I deliberately did very little research as far as Ehrman and Craig and philosophy of religion in this particular area is concerned, so I probably missed some paper someone wrote or rebuttal someone made. I just wanted to make that clear. If you like this video, I would highly recommend subscribing to my channel because I try to make every video as interesting and nuanced as this one is. In particular, I think my 2 videos on Pascal's wager would be of interest to you. Please share and discuss whatever ideas you have in the comments below. I try to respond to most comments, especially if they engage with the topic directly. Also, I would appreciate a like on this video, but that's just silly old selfish me. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.